Welcome, everybody. Kathy Cummings is very smart. Was that good enough?
Yeah.
Kathy Cummings is a good friend of mine. Kathleen Sprows Cummings is Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame from 2012 to 2023. She served as the director of the Crucial Center for American Catholicism, which is a major player in bringing scholars in and sponsoring scholars doing research on the history of American Catholicism. And she's also the coordinator of the Conference on the History of Women Religious. She's an affiliated faculty member in Gender Studies, Italian Studies, and the Nanovic, how do you say it?
Nanovic.
The Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Her most recent book is entitled A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, published by UNC Press in 2018. 2019. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today. I want to especially thank Maddie for her help in coordinating the logistics, and Susie as well, and of course Mark Massa for all he does at the Boise Center and beyond. He's been a big supporter of me throughout my career, and I was very pleased when he invited me to speak here today. I have to say that I gave Mark a couple possible topics. I'm writing about a lot of different aspects, particularly about the history of Catholic women religious right now. I suggested that maybe we talk about the new movie Cabrini, and I could talk about fact versus fiction. I went to see that with Lauren a couple weeks ago. I suggested a couple other topics, as well as proposed this one, and Mark said, no, let's do Spotlight. And, it is not, the other topics were more lighthearted. This is not a lighthearted topic. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. I also want to acknowledge any survivors of sexual violence, either present here today or listening on the audio recording. Their statistics tell us there are many, and I suspect many of you, I know there are people in this room who have been touched by that. So I want to acknowledge that. And all I can really say is that the woman who figures very prominently in today's presentation and in the article that's forthcoming from this presentation, her name was Sister Catherine Mulkerrin. She was a sister of St. Joseph of Boston who worked for 2 years in the Chancery doing victim intake, 1992 to 1994. All I can say was that Sister Catherine was an exceptionally good listener who recorded details of sexual violence unflinchingly. And in that sense, she is an inspiration to me. And as a historian, I try to be a good listener. I've presented on this topic, I've been working on it for about 4 years now as a scholar, and I've presented on it in a variety of settings. I have to say that it hits a little differently, to quote Taylor Swift, here in Boston.
Where the bomb dropped.
Well, we'll talk about Spotlight, and I'm going to be using some documents that were made public in the wake of the Spotlight investigation to talk about how, as a historian, and how I think historians of American Catholicism need to engage with sources on clerical sex abuse to reinterpret and rethink some of their texts. But here, with the help of Terry McKiernan from Bishop Accountability, who's here, and I'll say a little bit more about our partnership in a project that we did, I was able to actually approximate the site in the Boston Chancery, which is now part of BC's Brighton campus, right across the street, where Sister Catherine would have met with with the victims as they came in. So, so I just want to acknowledge that this is something, and I hope that in the conversation we can talk more about that. I also want to acknowledge Katie McNally, who's now an archivist with the Catholic Religious Archives across the street in Brighton, which is fabulous, so much potential there for the study of Catholic men and women religious. But it was actually Katie that supplied me with the first document I'm going to seriously engage, which was an oral history that Sister Catherine recorded in December 1992, 4 months after she started working for the Chancery. So Katie, you and other archivists are superheroes. Brandy as well, Terry, I'm just so grateful. So I'm not going to do a big wind-up here. Maybe we can talk more about how I came to this topic in the Q&A. But I did want to say that this represents a new direction for me in scholarship. I had been following clerical sex abuse, like all of us, since January of 2002, when the Spotlight investigative team first broke the story on the pages of the Boston Globe. It was my first year. I was associate director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, which Mark mentioned, and as such was called upon to do quite a bit of public commentary. The director at the time was Scott Appleby, who addressed bishops in Dallas at their first meeting after that. So I always felt obliged to maintain, to stay up on revelations and clerical sexual abuse. But I really didn't think of engaging it as a historian. And so, for example, when I would be happy to talk to a journalist, but when someone would want someone with an expertise on the history of sexuality, I'd say, well, call Bob Worsey, right? Call someone who actually studies that as a topic, because that's not my particular area of expertise. And I'm not going to say a lot about this, but the summer of 2018, with the twin revelations about the former Cardinal McCarrick and his abuse, and then particularly the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which was released in August, that represented a real turning point for me. And I realized, and have only been more convinced in the years since, that you actually, I believe, cannot claim to be a credible historian of American Catholicism without acquiring at least a glancing familiarity with sources on sex abuse. And think about what happens when you do that, how it prompts you to revisit those texts and reinterpret these texts. So what I want to do today is almost just walk you through about how these sources that I've been engaging with have helped me reinterpret, and I think other historians too. In the wake of this summer of 2018, I did launch through the Cushwa Center a project called Gender, Sex, and Power Toward a History of Clerical Sex Abuse in the Catholic Church. And that was in partnership with, as I said, Terry McKiernan. And one of the fellows is present here, Jim O'Toole. And I don't want to speak for Jim, but maybe in the Q&A we can hear more about how Jim's work has been reshaped by engaging with that project as well. And I think that's true for so many of the participants in that. So if you want to find out more about that, I have linked the project there. I want to quote a colleague of mine and a collaborator of Mark, Catherine R. Osborne, who framed the question I'm going to consider today this way. When the spotlight, a pun, was turned on sexual abuse, what else did the light from its edges illuminate? And I think we're finding that as we delve more into the sources on sex abuse, they tell us about much more than sex abuse. They tell us about a host of things. So the first and major thing I'm going to talk about today is what it tells us about the history of Catholic sisters in the final third of the 20th century, which is a topic that I'm writing about. Here's a picture of Sister Catherine. This is from her New York Times obituary. She was eulogized as an activist nun. She was, as I said, a sister of St. Joseph of Boston. I celebrated St. Patrick's and St. Joseph's Day with the Sisters of St. Joseph over at the Brighton Mother House. Let me tell you, I know how to party. But again, in terms of being in Boston, I mean, Catherine is a household name there, literally a household name. So she's someone I never met in person, but I've come to know her through a variety of sources. So just quickly, she was born in 1935 to Irish immigrant parents in Medford, Massachusetts. She encountered the Sisters of St. Joseph in high school, at Matignon High School in Cambridge, and she perceived them to be very smart ladies and thought that she could become one of those herself, and indeed she did. She entered in 1954 along with 56 other women and was known as Sister Mary Martine. She was 19 years old, and the community at that point included about 1,600 women. 1954, so about a decade before the changes of the Second Vatican Council. This oral history I mentioned was recorded on December 6, 1992, and it was designed to hear from sisters. It's a very wide-ranging project of many Sisters of St. Joseph, but it was recorded with another Sister of St. Joseph, Sister Rosenda Gill. And this is a wonderful and very illuminating document. And Sister Catherine talks about the trials of those early years in the community. She found the isolation to be very crippling, the isolation of the novitiate, the injunction against particular friendships, things like that. Like many Catholic sisters, she helped subsidize a vast system of Catholic education. She taught mathematics in overcrowded classrooms in St. Teresa's in Roxbury for a couple of years. She was chosen to attend college, And when asked why she could not study literature, which she loved, she was sent to Simmons to study library science, she was told, we need librarians. So she lamented the lack of autonomy, and she talks about other aspects of that pre-Vatican II life, but she recalls having been heartened by a strong conviction that this is going to change, this will change. And of course it did. She was at the vanguard of change when it happened. This is a cartoon that's circulated throughout the Catholic United States to really illustrate that Catholic sisters embraced with enthusiasm aggiornamento, this idea of updating, and what it meant to be religious in the modern world. In Catherine's words, she recalled it as a time when they were called to move out of entrenched ways of thinking and think about new ways. She spent the years from 1906 to 1969, this is important, at the Order Scholasticate. This is where sisters studied and near where the novitiate was in Framingham, Massachusetts. And she recalled it as a good moment, a lively time. Theologians were coming in to talk about Vatican II all the time. Sisters were debating among themselves what their religious life was going to look like, both as individuals and as community members. In 1969, she was elected to the CSJ leadership team and served on it for the next 15 years, the final 6 of those as president. And she's very humble, but it's clear she was a remarkable leader during a time of cataclysmic change. She had an ability to attend to the individual needs of the 1,800-odd members of the community at that time, and also think corporately and represent the sisters. She was unflinching in challenging sexism within the church. She was a supporter of social initiatives of the Sisters of St. Joseph, some of which were controversial. She served on a task force invited by Cardinal Bernard Law to restructure leadership in the diocese and to have more of a role for the laity, in particular women. She saw this as a really good opportunity. In late spring 1992, Law again approached Mulkerrin with an opportunity to lead at the archdiocesan level. This was in the wake of the revelations of dozens of victims of James Porter, a priest in Fall River. And that precipitated so many victims coming forth in Boston that the Office of Ministerial Personnel in the Chancery, which had been headed by a Boston priest named John McCormick since 1984, it was basically overwhelmed, and Law told Mulkerrin that McCormick could no longer handle the volume on his own, and would she come and join the office? So she did. And by the time she spoke with Sister Rosenda for the oral history, she had been in the position for about 4 months. Sister Rosenda characterizes Mulkerrin's work as being on the cutting edge of the church in America. And Mulkerrin's a little more modest about that, but she does talk both in the oral history and in an interview she gave the following January in the Archdiocese newspaper when Law announced a new policy on clerical sexual misconduct. She talked about the need for the church to, quote, move beyond embarrassment, fear, or shame when dealing with reports of sexual abuse. She exhorted the whole church to walk together, and so we can talk about these situations and we can all become involved in addressing them. So this is a moment that for the second time in her religious life, she's sensing cataclysmic change on the horizon and has no illusions about how difficult and how even traumatic it's going to be. But her fears were tempered by her faith in the Catholic Church and in herself. She had guided a congregation to a pretty significant period of tumult, and in her view had emerged stronger, more inclusive, and better prepared to respond to the call of the gospel in the modern world. By this point, of course, she herself is one of the very smart ladies she had encountered in high school. And so she is confident at this moment that things, again, are going to change. What's very illustrative, then, is to juxtapose that fabulous oral history with another account Mulkerrin gave of herself almost exactly 10 years later, on December 19th, 2002, her 67th birthday, when she went to the law office of Roderick MacLeish to be deposed in the case of Gregory E. Ford et al. Versus Cardinal Bernard Law. 11 months had passed since the Spotlight investigative team published its first story. The main plaintiff in Ford had been abused by the Reverend Paul Shanley between 1983 and 1989, when he was between the ages of 6 and 12. Discovery in the case obtained more than 30,000 pages of documents related to more than 140 Boston priests alleged to have sexually abused minors. A memorandum filed in the case summarized allegations against 26 of them, and Mulkerrin had met with victims of 12 of them. Her fingerprints are literally all over the Spotlight scandal in the memos that she took. A transcript of the deposition runs to 571 pages, but I'm going to start with a single one of them as a springboard into her multi-layered entanglement in clerical sex abuse in Boston. On page 94, the record shows that McLeish asked Mulkerrin if she had ever heard of allegations of women being raped by priests during her time working at the Chancery. He prompts her, "Remember Thomas Forey? I'm sorry, Father Meffin." "Yes," she says. McLeish moves on. Now, Mulkerrin, of course, would have been prepared by her legal counsel not to reveal more than was strictly necessary. But yet her one-word answer is powerfully evocative in this. Writing about clerical sex abuse requires historians to probe the silences embedded in the sources. And in this case, it's only through an examination of subsequent testimony, press coverage, deposition exhibits, supplemental archival repositories that it's possible to reveal the volumes that her yes left unsaid. Starting with the fact that Robert Meffin was a name she would have been particularly unlikely to forget. These are all horrible stories, but Meffin stands out even among a pantheon of priest perpetrators as especially repulsive. Under the guise of spiritual direction, he initiated sexual acts with teenage girls, encouraging them to believe they were making love to Jesus Christ himself. In at least 3 documented cases, Meffin persuaded his victims to enter convents where he continued to abuse them as they took formal vows. The public learned the sordid details of Meffin's case only in the wake of the Spotlight investigation. The Boston Globe published a major story on it on December 4th. This is just 2 weeks before Mulkerrin's deposition. Church leaders, on the other hand, had been aware of the problems with Meffin's ministry since 1976. In 1984, Meffin informed the Archdiocese that he could not accept any regular assignment because he was occupied with a mission confided to him by God, which he is bound to keep secret. That alone convinced Boston's auxiliary bishop, John Darcy, to recommend to law that Meffin not be reassigned. And of course, Darcy, who became Bishop of Fort Wayne South Bend, had also cautioned law against appointing John Gagan as pastor of a parish in Weston. Law, as we know, ignored Darcy's advice in Meffin's case, and he did in Gagan's, and also that of Thomas Forey, a priest who had physically abused his housekeeper, and that was the perpetrator that McLeish had initially confused with Meffin in the deposition. Now, as we have seen, Mulkerrin volunteered only the bare minimum when asked if she remembered Meffin, but when pressed to do so, she reveals more, though not the entire story, which requires more archival digging that I've done. In January 1993, so about 6 weeks after she sat for that deposition, she received a call in the Chancery office from a former sister of St. Joseph who had seen Robert Meffin on a Catholic television show. Distraught and sickened, this former sister, told Mulkerrin that she knew of at least 3 sisters of St. Joseph who had been abused by Meffin during her own time in the community 25 years earlier. Now, we have to wonder what is going through Catherine Mulkerrin's mind during that phone call, because the sex abuse crisis is coming home to her in a very personal way in terms of the members of her own community. What we can verify is what she did next, which was follow her standard operating procedure. As soon as she received an allegation, she searched a locked file drawer which contained records of previous accusations. And in so doing, she recovered a 1986 charge that had been brought by a former CSJ against Meffin. She learned that there had been no adverse consequences for Meffin and only a feeble attempt to follow up with his accuser. Mulkerrin reached out to this woman, and although her name has been redacted from legal files, it's discovered quite easily through other sources, making it possible to verify that she had entered the CSJs in 1965 and withdrew in 1976. Now, it's not clear how well Mulkerrin would have known this woman or the other 2 CSJs known to have been among Meffin's victims. The congregation had about 1,800 members, and Mulkerrin was a dozen or so years ahead of them in religious life. But even if she had not known them personally, it's not conjecture to posit that she would have found them heart-wrenching, and given the timing, perhaps guilt-inducing. The abuse had taken place on her watch, so to speak. She was she was in leadership of the congregation. There's a lot to be said here. Meffin's case, I think, like Thomas Forey's and like many others, offers an important corrective to most studies and media accounts of sex abuse, which overwhelmingly focus on male victims. One of our, a few of our scholars in gender, sex, and power are thinking about the implications of that. And I will say it's getting more attention with the revelations in the Mario Rupnik case internationally. Marie Griffith, who's a colleague of ours, is writing about abuse of girls And she has coined the term holy subservience to think about how Catholic gender norms kind of exacerbated abuse. And so what I'm doing is thinking about holy subservience from an angle of Mulkerrin's experience as a female in name authority figure in the Catholic Church. Her experience in the Chancery highlights what I see as the interlocking hierarchies that created the Catholic sex abuse crisis, clergy sex abuse crisis. Yes, adults over children, but also hierarchy over clergy, clergy over laity, and of course in the Catholic tradition, men over women. In the passage from the Ford deposition, so we're still on one page, in the passage that comes immediately after that, I'll let you read it, but Eric McLeish read this aloud. It's an excerpt from a memo from Mulkerrin to McCormick dated May 18th, 1994. Maybe by the books feels like a second victimization. The burden is put on a minor all over again and now his family. Broken record by CEM. It has come to our attention that a priest stationed here between blank and blank may have molested children. Please contact ... parish bulletin. This memo is referring to, and here's the original. It's another, which is part of the exhibit documents in the Ford case. Another protocol Mulkerrin developed. She reviewed the abuser's assignment card, mostly to see if he was still in active ministry. But of course, it also revealed all his previous assignments. So she suggested that this information be used to help victims. Upon hearing credible allegations, the Archdiocese should publish brief notes in weekly bulletins of all the parishes in which he had worked, listing the dates of the priest service, explaining he'd been accused of sexual misconduct, and invite parishioners who had any relevant information to come forward. Her intent was not to gather evidence against the priest. She was focused on consoling survivors. She had learned by this point through experience listening to them that having someone listen to their story offered a measure of comfort and healing. And she hoped that the notices would encourage those who had kept their secrets for years to come forward so that they might be freed. This was implemented in St. Teresa's Parish in Roxbury, where Mulkerrin had taught in her early years as a CSJ, but that appears to have been a very isolated incident. She was frustrated that her recommendations had been not more widely followed, and in the deposition, she uses gendered language to express that frustration. She says, "I wrote broken record. Any woman saying anything 2 or 3 times or whatever times is a broken record." The deposition reveals the way gender dynamics also shaped her job description. Law had offered her the position, presenting it to her as originating in a need for a division of labor precipitated by victim overload. Instead, it functioned as a differentiation of labor. Mulkerrin would meet with the victims and report to McCormick, who would in turn communicate with the accused priests. She recalled that she had always felt, quote, very free to say exactly what I was thinking to McCormick, but less certain, even at the time, that he had listened. She later admitted that McCormick always seemed to have more of a feel for priests than victims. Now, in the interest of time, I know we want to have plenty of time for discussion. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but Mulkerrin's hunch was true. There's ample evidence that McCormick had more of a feel for priests than victims. Here he is kind of dismissing the claims of the father of a boy that had been abused by Joseph Birmingham, who had been his seminary classmate at St. John's, and he had been stationed with Birmingham at a parish, at Our Lady of Fatima Parish, and then also when he was working in the Office of Ministerial Personnel, he attempted to cover it up in a lot of ways. Now, Mulkerrin had worked with had spoken to many of Birmingham's victims. She later admitted that she only learned of McCormick's personal connection to Birmingham from the Globe, and that she didn't recall him ever disclosing that when they were discussing the Birmingham case. This gender division of labor is also evident in the operations of the Archdiocesan Review Board. Mulkerrin attended all the meetings, but as she later put it, she was not on it with voice. She had never been invited to present and was never consulted in advance of the meetings by McCormick, who presided over them. This is stunning, given that Mulkerrin arguably had a better and more integrated knowledge of sex abuse than anyone in the Archdiocese. She knew the name of each accused priest, his entire assignment history. McCormick never met with victims, but Mulkerrin conducted interviews with over 200 of them. She connected survivors to therapists, processed reimbursement funds, and all that. all that she did, many, and again, this is, I can't go through all of them, but there are many really poignant letters from survivors who testify that she helped them, and that one remembered that the most difficult part of the process was giving the graphic details of what happened for obvious reasons. And as a result, she found it easier to disclose those details to a woman, a non-male authority figure. Here's another letter from a survivor talking about how pained, and there's lots of evidence to talk about how personally she was pained by their testimony. To one, she wrote, "I am in awe of your honesty and your capacity and will to journey through years of suffering." Mulkerrin's efforts, and I've only just briefly summarized them here, but they later impressed even McLeish, who treated her far more gingerly than he did other witnesses in the deposition. "Let's talk about what you tried to do here, sister," he said at one point, which was a lot. But McLeish and his associate also prevailed upon Mulkerrin to concede that there were many things she did not do. She did not verify that the psychologist who sat on the review board had any expertise in abuse. He did not. He was a forensic psychologist. She never went to the police. She did not commute to anyone apart from McCormick, the scale and magnitude of the abuse, and she never ascertained that law knew what she knew. As she explained to the prosecutor, she had assumed this would be communicated. She understood herself to be a conduit and trusted that the system that she was a part of was going to work. The hierarchical and indeed patriarchal firewall around Mulkerrin was so firmly in place that she had very little interaction with the law during her time at the Chancery. She saw him on just a handful of occasions in 2 years, counting the times she'd requested an appointment to tender her resignation. Even then, the Cardinal's secretary apparently forgot to record it on his schedule, and as he was on his way out of the country, he breezed through it. She had 10 minutes with the Cardinal during which she told him that she was no longer spiritually, psychologically, or physically capable of doing the work required of her. She's even more forthright 8 years later in the Ford deposition. She characterizes herself as traumatized and describes her experience as a nightmare. She officially left the Office of Ministerial Personnel in September 1994. She understood her experience in the Chancery as a failure, but she accepted that failure as a personal one and kind of blamed it on herself, uniquely her own. And I think when we map it on to other stories, we see it more as a systemic failure. And now, Mulkerrin did not record another oral history. She didn't speak publicly about her role. But when you go back to that document, as I've done many times, the resonance of her 2 years in the Chancery office really bring out moments in the oral history. For example, the whole time she worked in the Chancery, she commuted to the retreat house, the community retreat house in Cohasset, about a 50-mile drive away, even though the mother house was right down the street. And she did that because of the sensitive nature of... But she had talked in the oral history about how as an extrovert, she hated to be isolated. And here she is finding isolation again at this point in her religious life. Were her memories of teaching at St. Teresa's troubled by the fact that 3 students had been abused by 2 parish priests during her tenure there, including one young boy who had been in her mathematics class? That time in Framingham, 1966 to 1969, would she still have described it as a good time, a lively time, while she was engaging with different theologians and thinking about Vatican II, exhilarated and inspired? It must have tortured her to realize that the novices just still living across the road were being violated by Robert Meffin during that time. Would she have viewed her service on the Archdiocesan Task Force as a sign that the Church was committed to women leadership? Any faith she had in herself as a leader must have been seriously eroded by the time she left the Chancery office. In fact, she had been an authority figure, but in name only, a leader who exercised little influence and wielded no power. And this was a woman who was a proven leader. And that's the thing, right? I mean, if anyone was going to go in there and get things done, it was Sister Catherine Mulkerrin. And she failed spectacularly, as she herself acknowledged. So I want to wrap this up, although I could talk more. But I want to return to that evocative query by Catherine Osborne. Shining a spotlight on Mulkerrin's experience illuminates so much more about the history of Catholicism or the particular incidents of clergy sexual abuse. Because she never recorded another oral history, we can't know for certainty the extent to which her experience prompted her to rethink her personal trajectory as a sister in the 20th century. But what we can do is ask how her story challenges a narrative that historians like me, have crafted about women like her. That oral history and many others like it, I've read lots of these sources, it tells one story about Catholic sisters' experience in the aftermath of Vatican II. Her first 40 years in the community tell this one story. Her final 14 years in the community tell a completely different story. Read alone, Mulkerrin's 1992 oral history presents the Vatican II period as an era of openness, empowerment, autonomy, and leadership for Catholic sisters. When you read it in concert with the Ford deposition, that narrative becomes impossible to support. It must be contained and qualified. I'm going to end by just talking about a few other narratives that are upended by Spotlight's glare. And Meffen's case alone, if we take his case, it points to another of them. I have taught this document for many years in my Catholics in America classes at Notre Dame. It is like the best-selling Awful Disclosures of the Hotel Dieu Nunnery by Mariah Monk, as well as other similarly themed books, pamphlets, and cartoons. This is a sensational expose that chronicled the sexual crimes that allegedly occurred in Catholic spaces such as confessionals and convents, where Catholic women were particularly vulnerable. Historian Richard Hofstadter memorably dubbed publications of this genre the pornography of the Puritan, interpreting them primarily as manifestations of the anti-Catholic animus that pervaded antebellum America. Anti-Catholics, he wrote, invented an immense lore about libertine priests, the confessional's opportunity for seduction, licentious convents, and monasteries. I remember the first time I taught this after I had read the Meffen file. Now, I want to be very careful here. As historians, we have to be rigorously grounded in the specificities of time and place, and I want to acknowledge that. So we're not playing fast and loose with chronology at all. But all I'm suggesting is that it's now disingenuous to present sources like these merely as anti-Catholic tropes. These lurid Protestant fantasies we know have yielded to grim Catholic realities. And how do we deal with that? How do we teach it? How do we talk about it? We have to pay attention to them. I don't have all the answers to this, but I think it's a question that we're all asking as historians of Catholicism, and maybe Jim O'Toole can say more. Now, just as Meffen's misdeeds prompt historians to rethink the roots of religious prejudice against Catholics, other parts of his file disrupt aspects of a now standard narrative about their collective triumph over it. When his behavior had first attracted the negative attention of church leaders, Meffen had defended himself by complaining that, get this, the Archdiocese of Boston needed more priests like those in Going My Way. Everyone loved them, and they did priestly work, cooperating together, old and young. Meffen conjured his ideal priest from a 1942 film starring Bing Crosby as Father O'Malley, a dynamic and caring young priest who, in contrast to the elderly curmudgeon who serves as the pastor, befriends and wins over the young boys of the neighborhood. This is kind of a side thing, and Terry and I have talked about this, but I am astonished at the references to Going My Way that I find in these documents. Some of the people who are later accused of abuse, he was just like in Going My Way. It's really, there's a story there. Because Crosby's charismatic and smiling Father O'Malley marked such an abrupt contrast between the villainous Catholic priests that populated the vast anti-Catholic literature of antebellum America, historians have interpreted Going My Way as evidence of Catholics' arrival and acceptance in the mid-20th century. Viewed in the context of subsequent revelations of clergy sex abuse in the 20th century, however, the similarities between Crosby's character and the abusers who relied on affability, proximity to young people, and their elevated status in the community to cultivate victims become glaringly apparent. Like Mariah Monk, Father O'Malley plays a different role in U.S. Catholic history after the revelations of Spotlight and others. It's impossible to read even a few pages of Meffen's file or any number of other priest files without perceiving the hero of Going My Way as a creep. Can't watch it anymore. I can't show it. So that's yet another example. I could go on about sources that require reinterpretation, and again, I'm not alone in this. This is part of Endeavor. Let me wrap it up with the story of Robert Meffen, who was placed on leave in July of 1993 and granted senior priest retirement status in 1996. On that occasion, Law wrote to him to thank him in my name and in the name of the people of the Archdiocese for the ministry which you have offered in both hospital and parish settings since your ordination in 1953. He went on in this vein, concluding that the lives and hearts of many people have been touched by your sharing of the Lord's Spirit. In response, Meffin wrote an apologia in which he characterized himself as, wait for it, prisoner of love in a cell of allegation. In turn, Law praised the depth of your faith and the courage of your heart. You have touched me deeply, Bob. Remember, this was the man who wouldn't give 10 minutes to Catherine Mulkerrin. Meffin finally admitted his abuse in 2002 and was laicized in 2004. Of course, under intense scrutiny, Law resigned as Archbishop of Boston on December 12th, 2002, right before Mulkerrin's deposition. And he wound up in Rome. Writing to another member of her community in 2007, Mulkerrin wryly referred to our current Roman resident after reading Ambition and Arrogance, a biography about one of Law's predecessors, Cardinal O'Connor. History repeats itself, Mulkerrin wrote, at least many echoes. How sad. Mulkerrin had spent the intervening years working as a parish minister in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when she returned to 1994 to 1998, when she returned to Boston and worked as a spiritual director until she died from a recurrence of breast cancer in 2008. Okay, that is where my formal comments end. I think hopefully you can see what I'm trying to do here is to think that anyone, and I tell my doctoral students, I tell my colleagues, that this is something that we need to grapple with. And it's no longer possible to say, oh, I don't write about clerical sex abuse. That's not my area of expertise. And I'm not suggesting we all have to, like I said, I've got lots of other projects I'm writing that are far more lighthearted and fun than this one. But it is something that must always be engaged, I think, going forward. And we're starting to see the result of that. I think in the American Catholic Historical Association is roundtables on that. Publications that are emerging from our project are showing that. And again, I invite all of you to be part of this conversation in one way or another. And I certainly thank you for being here today and for listening.
Let me read off the question. As you know, chapter 10 of my book on anti-Catholicism is called Lawlessness in Boston, Cardinal Law and the Sanctuary Crisis, which I wrote.
Yes, I reviewed that book, remember? I think that was one of my first book reviews. I know, I was so nervous reviewing, I think for America or something.
I did that book because of an event that I was at Holy Cross Cathedral, which is Boston's Catholic Cathedral, where a woman stood up and Law was preaching, and she was not a street person. I would describe her as a Wellesley matron, very well-dressed person. She was up and screamed, "Why don't you sit down, you old fart? You have no authority in this place." And I thought, I'm writing a book called Anti-Catholicism. So I went back and I went to the website of the Boston Globe. At that point, the Globe had subpoenaed and won the personnel files of dozens and dozens of priests. And going through that, the thing that struck me, even then, this was in 2002, almost all the people who wrote to the Chancery were women. Mm-hmm. You know, the overwhelming majority of people, mothers or aunts of children of boys who have been accused. I noted that, and I said like one line about it, but why is that? I mean, obviously the misogyny involved here is intrinsic. I mean, the major, narrative is they were protecting. What this was about was protecting the church, protecting the institutional church against a failure to. But isn't misogyny basic to what's going on?
Absolutely, and we haven't grappled with that yet. The article that will appear in the journal, The History of Sexuality, so not a Catholic publication, but is called Good Apples and Broken Records, Gender and Hierarchy in the Clerical Sex Abuse Scandal. Broken Records is the eponymous, Mulkerrin named herself that. I call her a good apple. That's to refute the theory that we all know is a few bad apples in the that caused this. She's a reasonably sympathetic figure. She tried very, very hard. She failed in a lot of ways, but she tried. But she didn't fail. And I want to emphasize she didn't fail in her relationship with survivors, and it's really remarkable the documentation on that. But structurally, she absolutely failed. So yeah, I think misogyny is all over this. I think in terms of mother, Marie Griffith is writing quite a bit about mothers, and I don't want to generalize about. and actually I can't begin to say how many mothers versus fathers. In the Birmingham case, it was fathers that were writing, so it's not that fathers weren't into this. But yeah, and I think, my colleague and co-investigator in gender, sex, and power is Bob Orsi, and he talks about what's Catholic about the Catholic sex abuse crisis. And I frankly get a lot of pushback at Notre Dame and beyond. Don't you know? Coaches, Chicago public school teachers, Boy Scouts, they all abuse. Yes, absolutely true. And there should be projects about all of them. Everybody, this should be studied. But the what about is just not. So one of my responses, and I said it just briefly here, is that I think we need to think more seriously, and I'm certainly trying to do so, about these interlocking hierarchies that regrettably, and people will say, well, what about in families? Yes, absolutely. But, wherever adults have access to children, there is this abuse. But in the Catholic spaces, these interlocking hierarchies of, and I can't get over Mulkerrin just assuming. I mean, this is a woman who you think in red she should have known, right? I mean, there she was. She was in leadership from 1969 to 1984. Imagine that time. She had seen it all. She thought.
Women weren't taken seriously in any space back then, except for in the classroom, basically. Yeah.
Well, but as a time, I think the sense that this was changing, and that women like her, superior of a major religious congregation, who was moving from teaching and nursing into other kinds of ministries, that's in 1984, and she's on that task force. She believes it's a clear sign that women are being empowered to do this, and that's a narrative that exists out there about this as a time when Catholic sisters were becoming formidable leaders in spaces beyond their own ones that they were in control of. But anyway, to go back to your question, yes, we need to think more about even this idea of I think it's, Terry, you can correct me, but 85% of the under 18 are male victims, something like that. And I've talked to different people about that. It's believed that it's underreported by the media, but perhaps just that the idea that this was part of gender norms, that the control that men had over girls, that made it a category that we don't think about. That's what Marie Griffith is writing about too. So, absolutely. Yes.
Hi. So I actually I grew up in Oak Square and went to St. Columkills, where Father B, which is what we called him, Father Birmingham, was assigned. And, when this all came out, we were all kind of like, what? But one of the things that we was 2002. So we were having children, so we were in our 30s, learning about what was going on when we were teenagers. We couldn't understand why they would put a man who had these allegations against him in charge of the Catholic Youth Organization. He was our head of CYO. We went away on trips with him, stayed out of state, in hotels. Like, it's just really creepy to think back then. And I know that, don't know particularly, but some of who we think are some of his victims, there was trouble at the house. Like, their family was broken, or, the parents were alcoholics, and so he would take them on trips. Yeah. And so now we're just we have issues with all of that. But how do they put somebody like that in charge of high schoolers? That's a huge question that we just cannot even
fathom.
It makes no sense.
It makes no.
And knowing how far back some of these letters go, it's seriously troubling. Fortunately, he died of cancer, and
he died in 19. But he was dead by the time this.
Yes.
But many of his survivors.
I'm glad that they did. But
yeah.
Father Gagan was the oddest person ever.
Yeah.
I grew up in going to St. Julia's in Weston, but I ran into Father Gagan at the grocery store, and later on. There was an expose of Father Gagan's sister, and she was just as odd. And it couldn't fathom me that these other men didn't understand that this man was odd. I mean, it was just very, very apparent.
But even then, I mean,
Not that they'd be abusers.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, they didn't really have a case against Gagan when they went to and he did the same thing. He was stationed in Weston, but he was courting a family that lived in a project in Waltham. And that's the boy that he abused that they got him on. But I knew the attorney that was in the case, and she said, I really didn't have a case. And just for some reason, they got him on, the jury went that way. But he preyed on the same situation.
I love that scene in Spotlight where the reporter goes to the Gagan sister's house and knocks on and John Gagan himself answers. And the reporter says, did you in fact do this? And he said, yes, but I didn't enjoy it. I mean, talking about pathology, massive worlds of pathology.
But and so then later on, I asked a priest, I said, what kind of psychological testing do they do when you go to St. John's and say you want to enter? He said, none.
Unlike the Society of Jesus.
Yeah, we had
No, I'm just saying that was, and so also in our parish in Wayland, one of the priests was accused. And they took him off and blah, blah, blah. And it turned out that the diocese didn't do anything to help him. There was a parishioner in our parish that finally said, let's go look at this. He wasn't even at the parish that at the time when he was accused, but it wasn't Cardinal Law and his people taking care of this. It was some parishioner that took pity on this guy that was totally ashamed and, kind of ruined by being falsely accused. But there again, the Archdiocese did nothing, for their own.
Yeah, Lauren?
Thank you, Professor Cummings. This was a fabulous presentation. I'm struck by the bravery of Mulkerrin, also the talent that she had with listening. I'm curious if you shared a lot about how defeated she felt at the end and how her findings really eroded the liveliness of her past experiences. And that she was traumatized. Do you have a sense for how this impacted her relationships with other women religious, and or how it impacted her faith? And then the second part of my question is, who has followed? My sense is that she probably represents one example of a Catholic sister who did this kind of work. So who else has been part of this trend, and who has followed in her footsteps since?
Well, literally, she was succeeded by another member of her community, Sister Rita McCarthy, and there's ample material on her as well. And then a laywoman named Barbara Thorpe. Terry, what were Barbara's years? Terry has an encyclopedia.
She came into office, I believe, in 2002 and worked for 10 years doing that. Yeah. She wasn't a religious, but a woman in the same role.
There are many other examples. I'm, as you were both talking, I'm from Philadelphia, which, is not any, it's the same thing. And I remember being a grade school student in the 1980s and knowing Father so-and-so. Well, it worked both ways, right? There was the guy who was a creep, and everybody knew that. And then there was the guy who was like going my way. I mean, it's both of those things. But Philadelphia, there were sisters who were, I wouldn't, there are whistleblowers too. There are many sisters who were whistleblowers. I don't think Mulkerrin falls into that category necessarily. She didn't blow the whistle, but I think it's a really fruitful area for more research. And I have names and stories of other women, but this is possibly just a very, very interesting angle. But as far as her faith, it gets anecdotal right now, and luckily there are a lot of CSJs, and they are very willing to tell stories.
How many are there?
Katie?
I want to say a little over 100.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Wow.
Yeah. So like I said, I was just there this weekend, and Catherine is literally a household name. Bridge Over Troubled Water, which, is a controversy, one remembered the way she supported that, even though it had, just do it, I have some correspondence of her. I have, and she was a parish, I went to her where she lived in Scranton, right next to the cathedral, so she still worked for a diocese. She was a pastoral minister there, and then a spiritual director. She was trained in spiritual direction at Fordham. I didn't say that part of her biography pre the Office of Ministerial Personnel, but she was a trained spiritual director and worked at the retreat center and that kind of thing. So, I don't think she lost her faith in God. She didn't lose her faith in her community. She was a member of her community. But yeah, gosh, I would love to have met her. That's weird. As a story, most of my subjects are long dead, so to someone who, what if in 2002 I had been thinking about this not as a public commentator, but as a historian, but that's an impetus to now think about who can we talk to? How is this part of living memory? Yeah.
Kathy, are you going to continue to research and write on this particular topic? And related to that, are you cross paths with my 1965 ND classmate, Dr. Jim Muller, who in the early 2000s led one of the co-leaders in the laity response and criticism of law?
Of
Jim,
course, yeah, I talked to Jim. He was he called me out of the blue when, to introduce himself after Gender, Sex, and Power was launched, which we launched in March of 2020. And, and actually it was part of a grant program that Notre Dame founded to kind of stimulate scholarly research on sex abuse. And there were some hurdles in getting it funded, which we overcame, but it maybe funded 10 projects, and I think we're the only one. Maybe one other, that's not true. One other one has moved forward, but we actually did it, and we did it so much better than we could have without a pandemic, I think, because we planned to meet twice in person, and everybody was going to, kind of do their work, and then we'd come together and have a conference, and then we Zoomed. We Zoomed, and I remember our first Zoom was June 16th, 2020, and George Floyd had just happened, and that was such an uncertain time. And I remember Bob Orsi calling me and saying, we got to postpone. We had a survivor come to speak to us. We were all at that point in our sources, and should we postpone? And we decided not to postpone. And one of our participants, one of our scholars who's also a survivor and an activist, wrote to me and said, you did the right thing. Survivors don't get to pick when they talk about it, and moving forward at a time when we're just feeling beaten down is actually an act of solidarity with survivors, and that has always kind of stayed with me. I have the count somewhere in here. It's in my final report for the project, but we met, I think, 17 times as a group via Zoom, and then we had subgroups. We had groups working on priests. We had groups working on gender, many things. And it was a solace. It sounds crazy to say that because there's this horrific stuff, but I don't think like writing about and Terry was amazing in what the sources he was able to provide us access to at a time when traditional archives were inaccessible, and he provided collective guidance as well as individual, and continues to. But to do that as part of a community, and we were coming from different, some of us were very involved in Catholic history, some of us were coming more from a gender perspective, some of us were coming from really no knowledge at all. It really was wonderful to do that in communities. We kind of reinvented what community was, and then we did all get together for a symposium, and the work is bearing fruit. Jim has a book coming out next year on confession, which is shaped by this project. Other people have books and articles coming out. So yes, I am going to continue to work on this. I have, like I said, I have lots of other projects. But yeah, this is you have to, I don't have a choice, I guess. Many of us don't. So Jim, I'm sorry to call you
on this campus, I can say one of the benefits of the pandemic was we didn't have to go to South Bend all that often.
It's true. Yeah.
Which Jesuits refer to as Catholic Disneyland.
Yeah.
Other questions? thank you so much. This is really